how sweet, when he comes in the sky. What joy, when he comes in glory by and by. Let's pray together. Go ahead and be seated. Thank you, J.M.
All right. Silence up. Good evening. Well, Logan was supposed to have this tonight, but he called me today and he was really tore up about it. And so he's not gonna be able to make it. I'm just kidding. He had a baby, so that's he's got priorities elsewhere, and so we're really happy for them. He did tell me this last night that he wasn't gonna be able to make it, and we swapped. So if you don't like if this doesn't go well, you can take your complaints to Logan. So on relatively short notice, I was trying to think about something, figure out what to do, and it's kind of hard to narrow down one thing, and so kind of for me, I started thinking like, okay, well, what are the things in my life that I need to work on? Because like teachers used to say, if you have a question, raise your hand, because someone else is probably thinking the same thing. So I'm kind of going with that. I've been fairly trustworthy sources in my life, so we'll accept it as truth, and hope that maybe this helps. So the thing that right now I think I've struggled with, one of the things is just finding time to spend time in the Word, finding time for prayer, making that a priority in my life. We're busy. We've been busy. I know everybody's been busy. We've had graduations and parties and a lot of obligations that pull on our time, and so one of the things for me is how do I do that? How do I make that a priority, and what's the reason? So one of the lessons I heard one time about this comes from the story of Noah, and it seems maybe like an unlikely source, and it's really it wasn't even from a religious podcast or lecture. It was from kind of from a secular perspective. There was a biblical series. I don't know if anybody's heard of Jordan Peterson. He's like kind of I see some heads nodding, so some people know, but he's a psychologist that does some series, and he has a biblical lecture. And if you've got several hours to dedicate to it, it's a good listen. You might have to pause it. I did several times and try to wrap my head around it. But his story about Noah as he sort of dissects the story of Noah. And man, it's stuck with me for a long time. So I'll try to kind of condense it and make my point here. So I think we all understand the story of Noah, right? World's wicked. God comes to him, says, I need you to build an ark. Tells him exactly how, gives him the dimensions and everything, and he says, sure thing, got it, and he gets to work. And it's, according to the dimensions, it was quite the task. There was no indication other than God telling him to build the ark, but he obeyed. He did it. He put the work in, which was a sizable effort. You can tell from the dimensions it would have been a lot of work. Flood comes and wipes out all the earth, but Noah and the animals, and God favored him. He was a righteous man, and he's saved. I think we all know that one. Did anybody ever, when they were in growing up, did the teachers ever tell you, like in Bible school, that he was made fun of? Okay, that's not in there, right? It's not actually in there. I reread it, and it's not there. You have? Okay. It's fine. I imagine it probably did happen. It seems likely, but I thought that was in there for sure. I had to reread it a couple times. No, it doesn't ever say that. I was just thought that was interesting. So, anyways, what's the takeaway from that as it pertains to us finding time, making that a priority? Well, the thing that I wish it was like this, some like epiphany I had, but from listening to that lecture was build your ark. In the good times, when it's sunny outside, God tells us to make that a priority. We got to build our ark because the storm's coming. In some way, somehow, whether it's cancer, losing a loved one, whether it's any number of ways, storms come in our lives. And if they haven't come, just wait, I know we've had a lot of, seems like lately, we've had storms, we've had sickness, we've had loved ones pass, and to get through those trying times, to make it through the storm, which is kind of, there's these sort of symbols that come up in Scripture, they come up throughout a lot of literature, and floods or storms or chaos and suffering. And I think the takeaway is build our ark whenever it's good. Take the time, make it a priority, spend time studying, spend time worshiping, spend time in prayer. Because that way, whenever the storm comes, you'll have your refuge. It's not going to be easy. I don't think there's any indication that the time on the ark was a Carnival cruise or anything particularly fun. I mean, you're in a confined space with lots of animals, livestock. We've seen feed yards. I think everybody's been through one, so you can kind of imagine, but it's a lot better than the alternative outside the ark. And so those times are going to be tough, but if you have your ark, you have your refuge. And really, for us, we have faith. We can trust Jesus as our refuge in our ark if we will lean in and build that relationship whenever, maybe even whenever it is tough to find time and things are pretty good and, life is going along. So I think that's the takeaway. Let's find time in our life. Let's make it a priority. And this is talking to me more than anybody else, but it's important that we do that now because it won't be that way forever. Storm's going to come, and when we do, we want to be able to take refuge in Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Let's stand as we sing this song real quick.
When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair. When the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. All right. We'll go ahead and be dismissed to classes. Be sure and get the announcement sheet in the back and read over those things. Remember, VBS is coming quick, and Sunday morning teachers are needed.
Well, good evening. We'll go to the first reading. It'll be 1 Samuel 28, 8 through 19. I'll introduce our question and we'll get to the reading in a moment. I think, we're family, and I can and have the ability to compartmentalize things when I'm struggling, when I'm hurting. Then I feel like that's not always a healthy thing, And so, it's fair for you to know I'm not 100% emotionally tonight. We had to put down our dog earlier today of 14 and a half years, and that dog has been in our home longer than Rebecca, and so it's been a rough afternoon. But Katie, of course, tried to say, well, you need to get someone else to teach. I'm like, no, I can't just dump these questions off on on someone at the last moment. These aren't easy questions, and so I got into my mind and said, well, I'll just block it all out. And well, I'm just trying to be honest and real, that if I'm not 100%, then I will. I don't want to say I expect your grace, like I presume upon it, but I believe in it, and we'll do the best that we can. Interesting question in light of that. It wasn't, thankfully, what happens when your pets die. That's an interesting question too. But this was, when you die, does your spirit or soul go to heaven with God, or does your spirit sleep or go to a holding place? And so, before I get far into that question, I just want to mention that spirit and soul are two different terms as well, and that could be a whole nother question. What's the difference between spirit and soul? Because I don't actually think they're the same thing. I think your soul is kind of the life force that is in your body. That, in essence, we could say the same thing about a dog. I know we don't say that a dog has a soul very often, but there's life in them. There's the breath of life, if that makes sense. Whereas a spirit is what we would usually differentiate ourselves from the animals, that we've been given something in us that does live on, after we die. And what way does it live on? And that's a question I get a lot of times, because quite frankly, it's quite relevant to everyone in this room, isn't it? That's something that we want to know, what's going to happen, when we die. And it's one of the big questions that every religion tries to answer, and certainly Christianity is not going to miss its opportunity to have an answer, for that. And so I do want to address that today as best I can. And I'm going to start with the Old Testament, even though the Old Testament is not explicit on this question. The existence of spirits of the dead were assumed, however, in some of the Old Testament stories, such as, for example, the banning of mediums. A medium was someone who supposedly could talk to the dead or have contact with the spirits of the dead. Well, if that was really just, make-believe or something like that, then perhaps you wouldn't have had to have such a forceful ban. You know what the penalty for doing that kind of practice was, right? It's death. Okay, under the law of Moses, you were killed if you were a medium. And it bothers me, this is an aside, but it's my soapbox, so I will use it here and there. When we see people make light of that today, and including different people who have magic shows or whatever, where they seemingly talk to the dead or a dead one's relative, I don't think Christians ought to be involved in any of that. By the way, some of you might have seen I'm promoting a magic show. It has none of that kind of stuff in it. It's for Broken and Mended fundraiser we're going to be having. They are Christian illusionists, and they don't even like to call themselves magicians because of that, unfortunate overlap with some of the stuff that people have practiced magic, whatever it might mean. The black magic and those things are condemned in Scripture, and including, spiritists that would try to talk to the dead. But there's a story about that actually happening in the Bible, and it has to do with Saul. And so let's read that, and we'll talk about that for a moment. So it's going to start in verse 8 of 1 Samuel chapter 28. Saul disguised himself by putting on different clothes. and set out with 2 of his men. They came to the woman at night, and Saul said, "Consult a spirit for me. Bring up for me the one I tell you." But the woman said to him, "You surely know what Saul has done, how he has killed the mediums and spiritists in the land. Why are you setting a trap for me to get me killed?" Then Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, nothing bad will happen to you because of this." "Who is it that you want me to bring up for you?" the woman asked. "Bring up Samuel for me," he answered. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed. It just makes me think maybe she was surprised that he showed up. And then she asked Saul, then she asked Saul, "Why did you deceive me? You are Saul." But the king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" "I see a spirit form coming up out of the earth," the woman answered. Then Saul asked her, "What does he look like?" "An old man is coming up," she replied. "He's wearing a robe." Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Samuel asked Saul. "I'm in serious trouble," replied Saul. Let's just stop there for a moment. So he goes on to tell him, basically prophesies that he's going to die in the next battle. All his sons are going to be killed. So this did not pay off for Saul in any way. Obviously, this doesn't answer the question directly about what happens when you die, but it does seem to indicate or assume the idea that there are spirits of the dead that go on living after the body is dead. Samuel is dead and buried. It doesn't appear that he is dead or he is trapped in his body or some other physical place, but he does say, "Why did you disturb me?" And so what he was being disturbed from, I don't know. But in any case, he was not real thrilled to have to go. He didn't like talking to Saul in his regular life. He didn't want to have to talk to him after he died. So he's a little bit upset about that. And all we really know beyond that is that this is Saul doing evil yet again. It just shows the kind of character that he has. If you flip over to, there's another quick passage I wanted to read in Psalm 116, verse 15. By the way, you can find little passages like this through Psalms and maybe even some other places. They're not any place where you could say, well, this is the passage that most talks about life after death in the Old Testament, because it's pretty scant. You get little hints of it. But here's an example of a passage that says something about it. Psalm 116, verse 15. And it doesn't really say what happens, but it just says the death of his faithful ones is valuable in the Lord's sight. Now, some of you may have a different translation, because that's different than what I looked at earlier. Someone that has a different translation, just read it. Okay, so precious or costly. Okay. And if this is precious to God, it seems to me to at least suggest that God is still concerned about his people that he knew, people that belonged to him after they died. Again, it's not any kind of explicit text on it. It's just a hint. And you'll find these kind of peppered throughout the Old Testament. I think a more interesting one is Job, though, and so I'm going to go over to Job 19, 25 through 27. This is a famous passage in Job. That's where we get our song, "I Know That My Redeemer Lives." And he proclaims there must be some opportunity to encounter or meet with God after he dies. And we'll talk about why he assumes that in just a moment. And I'm going to ask you, actually, why would Job believe this? And so in a moment, we'll have some feedback on that question. So think about that as we read it. Job 19, 25 through 27. "But I know my living Redeemer, and he will stand on the dust at last. Even after my skin has been destroyed, yet I will see God in my flesh. I will see him myself. My eyes will look at him, and not as a stranger. My heart longs within me." It's a beautiful passage. And this is in a time of Job's suffering in which, quite frankly, he thinks that God has betrayed him. And we'll get into all the things that Job thought some other time, but that's just his state of mind. And yet in that state of mind that he's in, he believes that he will see God face to face, and that they will know each other when this happens. After he says his skin has been destroyed. He's not just talking about the skin disease that he has. He's talking about death. Why do you think Job has that conclusion? No wrong answers. Something goes beyond. So he feels intuitively, you're saying, he kind of senses that something has to be afterwards. There's a passage in Ecclesiastes that speaks to that, doesn't it? He talks about God has set eternity in our hearts. Or is that what Augustine said? I thought there's a passage in Ecclesiastes that says that, but if someone looks that up and finds it later, let me know. I think that's in Ecclesiastes. She'll have watched me debate with myself up here. Let me ask you this question. I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint here, but maybe you can unpack this. What would the justice of God have to do with the potential life to come? I don't know if I asked that very well, but how does the justice of God factor into Job's reasoning about knowing that he will see God? Okay, Job has lived a righteous life, right? And so if Job believes that God is just and God is right, and Job goes to his grave betrayed by everyone, and everything that's happened to him, and he thinks, rightly or wrongly, he thinks even by God, he thinks that cannot stay that way. That cannot be the way that it ends. And that's why it's such a tremendous statement of faith when he says, I know my Redeemer lives. That he knows that there's going to be an accounting, there's going to be an answer for this, that God, because he is just, that if it's unjust now, then it's got to be made just later. And you can understand a little bit more when you how the Old Testament saints would have approached this subject then, and why they could have had an idea of life after death, even though the Bible in the Old Testament, and which was their Bible, was never explicit by it. But for them, that was the logical conclusion to the idea that there was a just God. Because in the world, you see things that are unjust all the time. And if the wicked kill the righteous and get away with it, and then they both go to their graves, and that's it, how can God be just? This is what they would ask. This is what they are asking in the book of Job and the Psalms and so many other places. Ecclesiastes even. Ecclesiastes talking about animals dying. He wanted to know what's the difference between me dying and the animals dying. You know, what justice is there in that? And so he's asking those questions. And they're all asking these questions, and they're all ultimately coming to a conclusion, even if it may vary a little bit in understanding what's going to happen. But they believe that because God is just, that somehow the righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will be punished. That's the only way to make sense of an unjust world that we live in. And by the way, I think it helps explain something else too for us as people who are New Testament people of God. Why does there sometimes seem to be a harsher practice of justice in the Old Testament? For example, some of you may have read, or you will be reading if you're doing the daily Bible reading, the story, very disturbing story, where David has to hand over for execution 7 male descendants of Saul to avenge what Saul did to the Gibeonites. So David doesn't execute them directly, but he hands them over to the Gibeonites, knowing that they're going to be executed. It appears from David's understanding what God would have him do to make this situation right. Even though these 7 male descendants of Saul are not the ones that committed the atrocities against the Gibeonites, that was Saul. But he killed all these people. Well, how are you going to even the scales is kind of the idea here. How is this going to be made right? And if you're the Gibeonites, maybe they believe in Yahweh, maybe not, or I don't know exactly what their frame of reference is. But they're going to be able to say, if this is not dealt with in a way that makes it just, they're going to be able to say, well, your God's not just. And so you wonder, why does this got to be reckoned this way? Well, we see that as barbaric. Well, there's a reason we see it as barbaric, which I want to get to momentarily, but it helps us to see how justice was carried out in the Old Testament with maybe a little bit more understanding. For example, another example, when someone accidentally killed someone, and under the law of Moses, what took place? Anybody remember? They could go to the refuge city, and why did they have to go to the refuge city? They could be killed. And if they were caught outside the refuge city by what was called the Avenger of Blood, was the Avenger of Blood held guilty? He wasn't. Because again, even if you accidentally kill someone, there's this idea of this unsettled justice. You've taken a life, you get to go on living. Well, you get to go on living, but you're going to do it in a particular place, and you're not to come out of there until the high priest is dead. And then when there's a new high priest, you're free to go. Just your luck if the high priest dies early on, is real old when you have to go, or maybe you just got a new high priest and you're going to be there for decades. Either way, that was the way. There was protection under the law for both the person who accidentally killed someone as well as the one who was the avenger for the family. So these are issues of justice that are playing out that, again, from our perspective, may seem barbaric or just a little bit extreme. But the reason why we're able to see it that way is because we understand that there is a day of judgment. And because we know there is a day of judgment, and we do understand there's a resurrection at the end of time, and everyone's going to stand before God, then we can follow what Paul says, quoting, I believe, the Proverbs, that justice is mine, says the Lord, I will avenge. And so we don't have to send out an avenger of blood in our day to get justice, because we know that God is just and there is a plan to deal with this. And by the way, it's also why we can be called upon to love our enemies. That was very unnatural in the Old Testament for them to do. It's still unnatural for us too. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying that for them it just seemed to be absurd that you would do this or have mercy on an enemy. But when Jesus comes and he's teaching us greater revelation than what has been given before, and we're able to understand that we can even love our enemies, because even if our enemies abuse us, that there is a just God and that we put our trust in him. It's a way of us proclaiming that our God is just, by showing that I don't have to take my own vengeance. I don't have to hit you back in the cheek after you've struck my cheek, because I'm following the God who's got this, basically, is the idea. And so you can see why kind of postulating this idea of an afterlife was important for them, and how these things began